Good morning. Good morning. I'm Lori Robinson, Acting Assistant Attorney General here at OJP, and I want to say good morning and welcome to all of you here. And a special welcome to those of you who have come from outside of OJP, from other parts of the department, and some of our visitors here from outside of the Justice Department, from the outside world. Very pleased that we have here today as a guest speaker Dr. Tom Tyler from New York University's Department of Psychology. And he's here to talk with us about the very important issues relating to police-community relationships and perceptions regarding those relationships. And as all of you know, these have been very much in the news of recent. Back in 2003, I had the occasion to hear Dr. Tyler speak. He made a presentation on some of these issues that you'll hear about today out at George Mason University. Both Chip Stewart, the former director of NIJ, who's sitting here in the front row, he and I were at that time on the George Mason University Administration of Justice Advisory Board, Steve Mostrovsky's board, and Tom Tyler had come to speak to that group. And I was incredibly struck by the talk. It made a very big impression on me. So much so that when the events recently occurred in Cambridge, Massachusetts, involving the arrest that all of us read about, involving Professor Gates, and the subsequent national debate that arose to quite a high-pitched level, I immediately went to Chris Rose and Tom Foyt at NIJ and Phelan Wyrick on my staff, and suggested that we bring Professor Tom Tyler here to speak to the Department of Justice. Now, the reason I felt so strongly about that was not to ask Tom Tyler to rehash the events that occurred in Cambridge that day, but to help us reflect in a constructive way going forward about how we might think about improving the way that police and citizens interact with one another. And our discussion today focuses on the notion of legitimacy, a key concept in Professor Tyler's research. When we talk about social order or questions of authority, legitimacy is usually taken to mean the sense of obligation to obey or defer to an authority. But incidents like the Gates episode also underscore perceptions of fairness, of procedural fairness, of just and appropriate processes that are very crucial to effective policing. Professor Tyler's research focuses on the connections between legitimacy and citizen willingness to cooperate with the police. Obviously, the police rely on the active cooperation of citizens and community residents. So understanding this notion of legitimacy is really crucial. This also means knowing what can cause legitimacy to degrade and what can be done to increase and sustain it. Sometimes these issues have been caught up in narrower discussions of racial profiling. And while it's clear that overt racial bias on the part of the police is a very significant issue we need to address, I think that Professor Tyler's work and today's lecture actually challenge us to broaden our frame of thinking beyond the question of race to larger issues of legitimacy and trust and confidence in the police. So we're glad to have the opportunity to hear from Professor Tyler today. I know it's very hard at the end of August in an academic's life to break away, Tom, so we really appreciate your coming here and to help stimulate a thoughtful discussion on these very complex issues. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tom Tyler.
Well, I think it's the hope of every criminal justice researcher that they will have something useful to say when a moment like the Gates incident comes up. And I'd like to say that for my part, having something useful to say about these issues is dependent upon the fact that over many years I've received support from NIJ to do the research that I'm going to talk about. So in a sense, I'm just coming here to tell you what you paid for, and I hope you think it was worth it. The Gates incident, which is what I'll refer to the events in Cambridge as during this talk, was clearly something that resonated all over America with lots of different groups of people in terms of the energy that was created around discussions about this event, efforts to think about what the message was that came out of this event. There are a lot of different ways you can think about the issue of racial profiling and how we might think about that issue. One way you can think about it is that the question is whether racial profiling actually occurs. So in the case of the Cambridge incident, was there actual profiling that went on in that case? Or more generally, does profiling occur? Do the police profile? If we define the issue of profiling in those terms, then the policy response is pretty straightforward. We need to do research on the statistics of the situation. We need number counting. We need to study who the police stop. We need to consider that in relationship to the likelihood that any particular person is actually predicted to commit a crime. And in fact, as I'm sure all of you know, studies of that type are already underway. And certainly there's an argument in Congress that there should be a law mandating further research of this type. And then we would use that statistical information to think about whether or not it's appropriate for the police to profile and when that might be acceptable. What I want to talk about is a really different image of what we might be interested in understanding. And that is perceived discrimination. That is, I'm going to talk about not whether there's actual profiling, but whether people perceive that profiling has occurred. The argument that I'm going to make is really straightforward. That successful policing depends upon the behavior of the members of the public. That there are two things that we really want out of the public. We want the public to comply with police orders, to comply with the law, and we want the public to cooperate in efforts to combat crime in different communities. The second argument that I want to make is that public behavior depends upon how the public perceives the police. That is, how people understand and interpret police behavior is crucial because it shapes whether or not people will comply with the police and cooperate in efforts to control crime. The basic model that Lori spoke about, that I'm going to use as the basis for what I present to you today, is a fairly straightforward model about people's attitudes. That if people believe that the public is experiencing fair procedures from the police, that is, if the police are exercising their authority through fair procedures, the public will believe that the police are legitimate authorities, accept their right to tell people what they should basically be doing in relationship to the law. And this leads to three positive consequences. People are more likely to defer to the police, to accept police decisions. They generally accept and obey the law in their everyday life, and they cooperate with police efforts to fight crime in their own communities. So a very simple argument. If you believe that the police are being procedurally fair, you view them as legitimate, you cooperate with them. So the key claims that I want to make are two. First, that the way the police exercise authority, the procedures that they use, are central to how people react to the police. The people are sensitive to the justice or injustice of police behavior. And second, that if the police are perceived to be legitimate, then the public will willingly and voluntarily cooperate with the police. Now, I don't think anyone would be surprised when we go back to the Gates incident to say that it clearly reflects the reality that there is a racial gap in public views about the police. This is evidence from a Pew Research Center poll that was taken shortly after the Gates incident. What it shows is a racial gap in interpretation of this event. So if you think of the Gates incident as an event, all of us drew some message from that event. White respondents were more likely to say that the incident should be blamed on Gates's behavior. Minority group respondents were more likely to say that the incident should be blamed on the police officer. What does that tell us? That tells us that when people look at this event and they think about what it means, they interpret it, that there's a difference based upon people's race. I think that this is important to us as criminal justice policymakers because the way that people understand the event shapes the way that they react to it. And my argument would be that whether people become defiant, whether they become angry, whether they resist the police, whether they're hostile towards the police, or whether they're accepting of police authority, defer to the police, depends upon how they understand the event that's occurring. So if we think about that in terms of this model, the way that people understand the fairness of the actions that the police are taking, in this case, leads to whether they accept the legitimacy of the police to, for example, ask for identification, and then how they're going to behave. Are they going to accept what the police tell them to do, or are they going to not accept it? The research that I've done on profiling is related to the question of whether people perceive that they have been profiled. So when you deal with some authority like a police officer, you have to decide why the experience that you're having is occurring. You could say the police officer stopped me because I was speeding. I was breaking the law. Or you could say the police officer stopped me because I'm black, or I'm a woman, or I'm young, or all of those. The point is that if you perceive that you were stopped because you're black, you were profiled, you're less likely to accept the authority of the police officer. You're going to view their actions as less legitimate, and they're going to provoke anger and not acceptance. A study of street encounters in Oakland and Los Angeles demonstrates this point. We find that when people perceive that the reason they were stopped is profiling, they're less willing to accept decisions. And in fact, when you control on the effect of this judgment, there's no ethnicity effect in acceptance of police decisions. In other words, it's all about your understanding of why you have been stopped by the police. And I think we all noticed that a perception that you've been treated unfairly provokes anger, even among highly educated, sophisticated people. And in general, there's a perception that there's a lot of procedural injustice in the form of profiling occurring. My argument is that that perception undermines the effectiveness of the police. The second part of this question is, why do people think that they've been profiled? The police, as I'm sure you're well aware, don't say to people, oh, I stopped you because you're black. They don't say that. They say you fit the description of someone, or there was a crime that occurred, or whatever. So you have to infer why you were actually stopped by the police. You might say it's pretty straightforward. If you're young, if you're black, if you're female, you're more likely to say that those characteristics motivated the police action. However, I'm going to argue that a crucial issue here is the behavior of the police officer. I mentioned that this is a study of street stops in Oakland and Los Angeles. People are asked to infer why they were stopped. And the question is, what aspects of the police behavior motivated people to think they were stopped, they were profiled, stopped due to their race? What's interesting is if you look at statistics of the relative weight that people put on different issues, two issues predominate in shaping people's reactions. How they were treated by the police in terms of whether the police were respectful, courteous, acknowledged their rights, explained their actions, and whether they thought the police were benevolent, sincere, trying to do the right thing in the situation. Whether they got a good or bad outcome was less important, and in fact, if you take account of these judgments, ethnicity then became completely unimportant, which is a way of saying the most important issue that shaped whether people thought they were profiled was how they were treated by the police. If the police treated them respectfully, with dignity, courtesy, so that it was the behavior of the police that were communicating a message that led people to make an inference about the nature of the motivation that led to their stop. This idea of interpersonal treatment as central to people's reactions is something that's going to be typical of the different studies that I'll talk about. Certainly shows up here with racial profiling, so I'll emphasize it. What are we talking about? Feeling that you're treated with dignity and respect, feeling that your rights are respected, feeling that the authorities care about you, that they're trying to do what's right in the situation, feeling that what you say is being listened to and considered by the police, even if they don't accept it. Those are the factors that lead people to feel that they receive fair treatment. So again, fair treatment, police are legitimate, their actions are voluntarily accepted. Or conversely, unfair treatment, illegitimate, anger, hostility. So in that sense, I think that the incident in Cambridge is an example of a broader question that we might be concerned about, and that is, how are people understanding their experiences with the police? Now, this point that police actions are a key issue was illustrated quite strikingly by the Gates incident. But what I would like to argue is that it's a more general statement about policing, that people react to the police in terms of the quality of the treatment that they experience when they deal with the police, that that's a crucial issue to people. The questions of dignity, courtesy, explanation, the sense that the person is trying to do the right thing, those are crucial issues. So if we think about this as a general question, not about racial profiling, but about policing, the question is, what legitimizes decisions or actions on the part of the police so that people are willing to accept them, voluntarily defer to them, don't have to be forced into compliance, but rather accept the authority, the legitimacy of the police, and voluntarily defer to police actions. I'm going to give you an example of research that addresses this general question. Again, this is a large sample of street encounters that people have had and some encounters with the courts, but I won't talk about those because 85% of the personal experiences that people had with the law were with the police. So I'll focus on those. I don't think it's a surprise to say that the police sometimes deliver undesirable outcomes. If you've ever gotten a traffic ticket, you're aware that that's something that the police do. People often call them to solve problems, and sometimes they don't solve those problems, and that's a negative outcome. Around 30% of the time when people deal with the police, they report that the outcome was negative. So that's a problem for the police to gain voluntary acceptance when you sometimes have to deliver negative outcomes. In the study of encounters with the police, we asked people about a variety of different aspects of their experience. And then we looked at the connection between those judgments and whether people willingly accepted whatever the police told them to do, to stop with their stereo at night, to pay a ticket because they've broken the law, whatever. So think for a minute about what aspect of experience you think really affects people. It might be natural to think that people are upset if they get a bad decision. So if you get a ticket, you'd say the decision did not favor me. I didn't want a ticket. Those are outcomes. But what about the fairness of the process? And I've mentioned in particular your interpersonal treatment. I was treated fairly by the police, but also the decisions that they made were made in fair ways. Two core aspects of how the police act, not what the outcome is. So think for a minute, which of these different factors will shape voluntary deference? If we divide up these different factors into outcome factors and procedural factors, we can see first that acceptance, willing acceptance, is dominated by procedural fairness, and in particular by the quality of the treatment that people experience when they deal with the police. Dignity and respect, respect for your rights, showing that the authority is concerned about your welfare, that they're listening to your arguments, considering what you're saying, dominates whether people say that they willingly go along with, accept the decisions made by the authority. And in fact, contrary to what many of us might initially think, whether it's a favorable or an unfavorable outcome has a minor effect on how people react. Further, this dominance of procedural fairness, quality of treatment, quality of decision making, is true no matter what the ethnic group of the person is. If we divide the sample up into whites, African Americans, and Hispanics, we see that it really doesn't make any difference. That in general, everyone, irrespective of their ethnic group, is primarily reacting to the police and accepting or not accepting police authority because of the process by which the police are exercising their authority, and not because of the outcome being good or bad. And it might initially seem strange to think of people not reacting to the quality of the outcome, but I can tell you as a person who's done many interviews that a number of people have stood in front of me and expressed rage about being let off in court, for example, when the judge wouldn't listen to them. The judge dismissed their case. They won. But the judge wouldn't listen to them explain their view of the situation, and they were furious. Well, that's a good outcome through a lousy process. And the point is that people are looking for a fairness of a process more than they're looking for winning or losing when they deal with legal authorities, and in this case in particular when they deal with the police. So the core first point is that irrespective of what ethnic group we're talking about, how people are treated dominates reactions to the police and helps us to understand an incident like the Gates incident, what was really involved in the reactions of Professor Gates to the police officer. What was he really reacting to when he reacted? Now I'm going to extend this using an example of a panel study of people in New York City who were interviewed both prior to and following personal experiences with the police. And I'm going to raise the question that I think flows from what I've just said to you, and that is, it seems to be my argument that the police can actually engage in policing activities while building their legitimacy if they exercise those activities through fair procedures. So think about the situation that you might experience. You are going home tonight. I don't know if any of you actually drive home, but you're stopped by the police, you get a ticket. Now as the police officer is walking back to his car, you're thinking, you know, I really respect the police as you wave the ticket. Is that really possible? These are interviews with people before and after, and they're only people who received a bad outcome through a fair procedure. So everyone in this sample got the ticket, but they said that the police officer treated them respectfully and listened to their arguments and didn't accept them, but listened. How does it, if this contact with the police, how does this affect their sense of the legitimacy of the police and their willingness to cooperate? I'll work with the police in my community to help fight crime. It goes up. So these people are significantly more supportive of the police after they've been stopped and given a ticket than they were before. So that actually you can exercise authority, you can deliver negative outcomes, and still build legitimacy, create cooperation, as long as you're sensitive to what people really care about, which is the quality of treatment. Well, what are some policy implications of this? And I just say, as a researcher, I understand I'm stepping into a minefield here because all of the policy people in the world are probably sitting in this room, and I'm not really a policy person. So I'm speculating, and I would welcome your thoughts about these policy implications. One implication, I think, is we have to think about a major strategy of policing that we've seen in recent years, which is zero tolerance policing. There's been a major expansion of street stops in a number of American cities under the framework of zero tolerance policing. I'm most familiar with New York City, so I'll talk about that. Between 2003 and 2007, street stops in New York City went up 500%, even though the crime rate was stable. And research suggests that the predominant focus of those stops was the minority community. So you have many, 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 many street stops involving minority group members. More recently, the federal government has been giving money, I guess that's all of you, giving money to the police to put more police on the street, which is going to further increase street stops. So I think that what we need to talk about in terms of the research that I'm presenting is what happens during street stops. That is, we need to think about how are those stops experienced by the people who are stopped. Professor Gates said something that, because it was very thoughtfully framed, people have repeated endlessly, which is that he experienced a teachable moment. But my argument is that every time a citizen deals with a police officer or a judge, that's a teachable moment. And what are they being taught? Are they being taught something that builds their sense of the legitimacy of the police, the legitimacy of the law, builds their motivation to cooperate with the police in fighting crime in their community? We need to think about a strategy for creating legitimacy as a goal. And we need to think about then the experience of street stops and their implications for a strategy of police legitimacy. And from that, a strategy of building public cooperation. And in that spirit, I think it's important to remind you of something that we often don't think about when we think about the police. If you think about policing, the image that we usually immediately come up with is someone being stopped by the police, given a traffic ticket. But in reality, the primary reason that people deal with the police is that they call the police for help. Or they get help on the street. These aren't calls, but the point is the main contact that people have with the police is they approach the police and ask the police to help them. Those contacts are fertile ground for teachable moments, for building legitimacy, building cooperation. Now, it's certainly true that as things stand now, this is less true for minority group members. But in a sense, what we're talking about is how to change that, so that when an officer comes to to Professor Gates' house, he isn't experienced in the same way that Professor Gates experienced the officer in Cambridge. How can we think about doing that? One clear area is police training. We need to think about how to focus attention on the treatment that people receive, how the police can put people at ease, create legitimacy. Several years ago, I was actually invited to give a talk like this at the FBI Academy, which, as you probably know, is the place that local police come for 6 weeks training before they go back to be officials in their own local police departments. And several things about that experience really stuck with me. One is the FBI Academy is in the middle of Quantico Marine Base. So all day long when you're talking about these issues, you hear machine guns in the background. So the whole framework for this 6 weeks is constant machine gun fire and bullets flying. The other is that in that curriculum, while there's a lot of emphasis on firearms and shooting straight and all that kind of thing, there's no emphasis on police-community relations. That's not in the curriculum. My argument is we really want to focus much more on the experience of policing from the point of view of the people who are being policed. Related to that is that we have to think about what you're rewarded for if you are, in fact, a police officer. The predominant and often the only focus is on crime control. If that's true, then the police officer is really only thinking about a strategy for reducing the number of crimes in a short-term sense. I think we need to think about how to build legitimacy as well as how to, in an immediate sense, focus on crime control. We need to create partnerships with communities through which we can build legitimacy. I don't think that this is an idea that people haven't thought of, because we have lots of examples, including DOJ, of efforts of this type. My argument would be that this is the focus that we should be emphasizing and expanding. What are some of the research implications? I think we need to study more directly, more experimentally, how different aspects of the experience that people have with police officers shape their experience of fair or unfair treatment, their sense of legitimacy. And we need to think about how we can create partnerships that are also experienced as fair by members of the community. Certainly we have community meetings with the police, but those are often criticized by community members who feel they don't really have voice in those meetings. Well, what do they mean by voice? What kind of experience would lead people to feel that they actually were involved in decisions about community policing in a fair way, that they were really cooperating to make decisions? Similarly, what's a fair process in a street encounter? What is it that people are really looking for? The other aspect of this that I think is really important is testing policing assumptions. And I think there are really two that are crucial here. One is the view of the police that projecting force makes them safer. This is something that I've experienced a lot in talking to police officers, the idea that dominating the situation, dominating the person is a safety issue. And in fact, it's interesting that Sergeant Crowley in the Boston police, the Cambridge police, gave that as his explanation for his behavior during the encounter with Professor Gates, the explanation that he was concerned about his safety, which is why he was doing the things that he was doing. But are the police actually safer if they use that strategy? Wouldn't they really be safer if they used a more cooperative, procedurally just strategy which diffuses anger and creates cooperation? Wouldn't that really be a safer approach? If you only cared about the policeman, I mean, forget about the citizen, but if you only cared about the safety of the policeman, I would argue that procedural justice would be a strategy we should advocate. I think that there's research that supports this, but not enough, and certainly not enough to convince the police that it's true. The other is, in the long term, I would argue that you actually would more effectively reduce the crime rate through a procedural justice strategy because you would gain compliance and cooperation from the community. So that actually this is a strategy that in the long run will most effectively reduce crime because it will engage people in cooperation with the law, in working with the police to police their communities. I've been talking about personal experiences because I think the Gates incident has made very clear to us personal experiences with the police can go very well or very badly. But I do think we also want to recognize that it's not just about personal encounters with the police. I don't know how many of you have had personal encounters with the police, but many middle-class whites, when you call them on the phone, say, I've never dealt with the police, or not in the last 5 years. I mean, I have no personal experience with the police. Does that mean that people don't react to the police and the law? I would argue no. And I think what we want are two kinds of behavior from the public in general: compliance with the law and cooperation with the police. So we can think in general, how do people's views about the police shape those behaviors? Again, procedural justice, legitimacy, compliance and cooperation, it's the same argument, except here it's about in general, not when you're stopped by the police for speeding. Now, to go back to the issue of race that we started out with, the fact that we might be talking about general views doesn't in any way change the situation that we started out with. This is national data on confidence in the police, 2004 to 2008. The white population in general has reasonably high confidence in the police. 60 to 70% say they have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence. The African American population, considerably lower. So there's a major gap based upon ethnicity. A recent Pew Research Center study makes the same point. If you look at confidence in local police to enforce the law, not use excessive force, treat all races equally, we see major differences connected up to ethnicity. So we know this. In general, there's a very large gap. Do such views matter? Views about the legitimacy of the police, do they matter? This is a study of New Yorkers, actually funded by NIJ, where I looked at the impact of views on behavior, obeying the law, and cooperating in the sense of if there were a criminal in your community, would you report it? If the police asked you to come to a community meeting to talk about policing, would you come? Well, you can think about why people might obey the law and cooperate with the police. One reason is they think the police are effective. They're reducing the crime rate in my neighborhood. They're generally high quality in the sense that they do a good job policing against disorder in my community. They are fair in the outcomes I receive. If I get a ticket, I deserve it. They're fair in the outcomes they produce for my group, my ethnic group. Or the police exercise their authority through fair procedures. Well, what matters? Again, procedural justice, that the police exercise their authority through fair procedures, dominates both the impact of judgments about the police on obeying the law and cooperating with the police. So that people in different communities in general are cooperating with the police because they think the police are exercising their authority fairly, are treating them respectfully as people, so that the same thing that's true in specific encounters is also true in general. Policy implications. I think we need to evaluate policies such as zero tolerance policing in terms of how they impact on legitimacy. And to do that, we need to collect data in some periodic way on the legitimacy of the police. As it stands now, we have crime rate data. And so naturally, if you want some kind of a performance-based measures, you have to look at crime rate because that's the data that we have. You can reward people or you can promote them based upon their ability to change the crime rate. But it's much harder to react to people in terms of their impact on feelings in the community because we don't measure that. So I think we need to think about how to provide data that counterbalances this focus on crime rate by providing alternative benchmarks that we can use to evaluate policing. Now, I've talked about personal experiences with the police, and I've talked about general public reactions to policing. I want to touch briefly on two areas of direct federal responsibility in terms of policing, because I know that the role of the federal government in terms of local policing can be limited. Terrorism and immigration. I think we all recognize that our concern about policing in recent years has expanded to be very focused on policing against terror threats. We then ask the question, what could we do to police against terror threats? And here I think we touch on the recent recommendations of the Rand Corporation that terrorism has to be treated as a policing issue because the police have the connections that allow them to get cooperation from the relevant local communities. And in this case, that community is the Muslim community in America. So what I have done is study the views of Muslims living in New York, interviewed them about their experience with the police, and looked at the connection between that experience and their willingness to cooperate in policing against terror. And we can ask the same question. We want cooperation from the community. What can the police do? Or how does the behavior of the police affect whether we get it? So let's think about two different issues. If there were someone building a bomb in the apartment next door, would you call the police? If there were someone spending all their time reading Al-Qaeda propaganda on the internet, would you contact the police? If the police asked you to work with them and other members of the community to come up with a strategy for policing against terror in your community? Would you come to a meeting? Would you help them? Okay. So it's the same question, cooperation. To some degree, it's affected by whether you say that the police are effective in fighting terror. To some degree, by whether you think terror is a serious threat. To some degree, by whether you identify with being a Muslim. To some degree, by whether you think terrorism is justified. And obviously, if you think it's justified, you're less likely to try to stop it. And primarily, then from my point of view, is it affected by whether you think that the authorities in the process of policing against terror treat people with dignity and respect, listen to people's concerns in deciding what to do, make neutral decisions about how to enforce the law? That, again, is the primary issue in both forms of cooperation. So the main reason that people are do not cooperate with not just local police, but the FBI, the immigration authorities, is because of the way they experience those authorities as exercising their authority. So that's an example of a special population, but one that I think is especially interesting to us right now. And then immigration. I don't have any research. I don't know of any research actually at this time, but I'll speculate that some of the same questions are relevant here. There's been a lot of discussion about using the local police to enforce immigration law, and I think it fits very nicely within this framework. The question is whether that's perceived as unfair, and the risk is that if it is perceived as an unfair procedure, then it undermines public cooperation with the police. So along the lines of the general argument here, we have to ask not just about if we're catching criminals, but also how is the general strategy we're using affected people's perceptions about the authorities and their willingness to cooperate. So again, if we think about the Gates incident as a teachable moment, the tricky part always is when you have a teachable moment, what's the lesson? This, I think, we don't even have to really specifically think about the Gates incident because the Attorney General raised this general question in a speech that he made is, if we're going to have a dialogue about race, then what's the dialogue about? What should be the message of that dialogue? And I think the Gates incident propelled that general question forward very dramatically. I think that the research suggests two different points about race and policing. One is that in terms of what people really want when they deal with the authorities, there really aren't major differences between different ethnic groups. That is, if you remember the California study, everyone was evaluating the police in the same terms, basically, of how fairly they were treated. What's true is that minority group members are much more likely to say that they historically have not and do not now receive fair treatment, which leads to lower legitimacy ratings, less deference to the police, and less cooperation from the minority community. Well, I think then that the solution to this general issue is to reframe the way we think about policing. What's the goal of policing? And in particular, I think we need to communicate the message that how members of the public, irrespective of ethnicity, experience the way the police are exercising policing authority. And to focus on how people evaluate the things that the police do, the actions that the police take when they're dealing with people in the community. And I don't say this, although I think you could easily say this on normative grounds, it's the right thing to do. I'm not saying it for that reason. I'm saying that because it affects what we most need to make policing work. It affects whether people defer to the police, cooperate with the police, view the police as legitimate authorities in their community. So we need to have the public thinking the police are acting fairly because we want the public to cooperate with the police. As always, from my point of view, The really tricky issue here is to think about how to make it happen. So I keep trying to think about what's in it for the police, since I think we often feel that we don't have a real lever to get the police to want to change. I think there are two potential levers. One is the argument which I've made that I think is supported by research, that this is a better way to achieve the goal of social order. That is, public cooperation is necessary to effectively manage crime and is a better way to achieve it than force. Second, which as I said I think is supported by research, although there could be more, is that the police would be better off. They would have a safer and less hostile working environment if they adopted a different strategy of policing. As I said, I think we all recognize that we have to find ways to emphasize gains to the police if we're going to change police culture. We have, in fact, treated the police the way I'm saying you shouldn't treat the public, in the sense that a lot of our strategies are about delivering punishments to the police for inappropriate behavior through accountability, punishment, lawsuits, litigation. My argument is we want the police to cooperate. So what we really need to do is to change what the police want to do by showing the benefits of adopting this new strategy. Why would we focus first on this strategy of building legitimacy? I think the point is that for most of the people in society, if we can engage their values, then we get the general benefits of cooperation. If there is a smaller group, and most criminologists would say that there is a smaller group who can't really be effectively touched in this way, we may have to use more traditional force-based approach for this smaller group. But we would free up an enormous amount of resources by engaging the larger group of people who can be engaged through values. The strategy of using force, the dominant strategy now, is undermining of the model that I'm describing, because it leads people to think of their relationship with the law, with the police, as one defined in terms of risk. Like most of you, when I'm driving on the freeway, I define my relationship with the state police primarily in terms of risk. And I think if we think of, we're creating that kind of a culture more generally. And we're undermining the relationship between people in the community, the relationship that's the basis of cooperation. So we can think of this more generally as two different models that go in different directions. The sanction model, the role of legitimacy declines. We need to increase sanctions. We need to have a larger police force, build more prisons, because cooperation goes down, public resistance goes up. Or we can imagine going this way. We build legitimacy, sanctions become less central, behavior is increasingly shaped by people's desire to cooperate. We can have fewer police in prisons. We can rely on people more to cooperate in policing. So I think that this is a great moment, a great teachable moment, to think about how we would all want to redefine and transform policing. And I argue that we have a general strategy that actually a lot of evidence supports that would address the concerns of all the people in America, white or minority, about what they're really wanting or looking for from the police, from the courts. And we should build upon that approach by trying to change the style of policing that dominates so that we can motivate voluntary acceptance and willing cooperation. So there are two key arguments, just to finish. That legitimacy matters, that it's important for authorities to have legitimacy because that motivates voluntary behavior, not compliance, but voluntary behavior, acceptance, cooperation, and that we actually know a lot about how to create and maintain legitimacy. It's all about people's experience of the fairness of the processes by which the police are exercising authority. And to me, that's a crucial argument, because if you said that you can't have legitimacy if you deliver negative outcomes, then we'd say the police can't win, because if they give you a ticket, you don't like them. But that's not true. That's not what the evidence suggests. You can exercise appropriate authority and still gain legitimacy if you do it in ways that people understand to be fair. So just two quick benefits. One benefit, everyone loves procedural justice. No matter how we cut it up in our studies, white, minority, rich, poor, liberal, conservative, everyone thinks that the most important issue when they're evaluating authorities is the fairness of the procedures. So in multicultural or diverse situations, you're addressing the concerns of all the different groups you're dealing with. And the other, which I put forward in this era of recession and austerity, is it doesn't cost a lot of money. In fact, it saves money, because you're reallocating resources from expensive surveillance and sanctioning to models that are much more reliant on people's own willing cooperation. And just finally, although it's a broader comment than the comments about policing, I think all the same arguments suggest that we might think about a generally different strategy of dealing with issues in criminal justice. That deterrence and punitiveness is a generally American model, an American characteristic, but there's a lot of evidence, like the evidence that I've shown you, that if we focus more on building values like legitimacy, we focus more on reconnecting people with values, following rule breaking, that might be a long-term strategy that's much more effective and actually cheaper. Thank you. Okay.
Well, Tom, that was extraordinarily provocative and broad-ranging. So let me now open it up to comments and questions. And I hope, though it's a long presentation, that you're willing to answer questions. Let's start out here with Chris Rose.
Tom, thank you for that presentation. It was fascinating. My question is around, if in a particular jurisdiction there's a police incident that damages the legitimacy in that community, can you earn that legitimacy back? And how difficult is it, and what has to happen in order to earn it back?
Well, I think that in general what we find is if you start with lower legitimacy, it's always more of a challenge. But at every level of the legitimacy, you can raise legitimacy through the experience of fair procedures on the part of the community, either through personal experiences that people have or through general information that people get about what the police are doing, how the police are treating people. That is, we always find that if people have the perception that the police are fair, that their legitimacy goes up. And I don't want to be unaware of the situation that you're raising, because certainly if you're starting out with bad relations between the police and the community, it's more of a long-term strategy. But we still do find that if people start at low levels of legitimacy, they move up as they experience increasing evidence of fairness on the part of the police. So I think it is a viable strategy. All right, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mary Lou Leary. Just as a follow-on to Chris's question, if you're in a community like Chicago, where they have long history of very bad relationships between the community and the police, is part of the long-term strategy to regain legitimacy, would that, in your view, would that have to include frank dialogue about the past?
Well, I definitely believe that people are very sensitive to whether or not their concerns are being listened to and addressed. So I think it would involve allowing people to honestly express their concerns about the police and have the police react to those in some way. What I think is encouraging is that when people feel that authorities are honestly considering what they're saying and listening to them, getting what they want in specific terms doesn't seem to be the crucial issue. What people have been offended by in community meetings with the police is the sense that the police come in with an agenda and just tell them what the agenda is. So there is something to be worked on in terms of creating a police culture that really wants to cooperate with the police. But we have seen that, for example, in Boston, communication between the police and ministers seems to be more of a genuine cooperative strategy. So I think it can happen. But I think that the genuineness of the police interest in hearing minority concerns is probably the issue.
Let's go over here. Chief Bierman.
Good morning. My name is Jim Bierman, and I'm a police chief in Southern California. So I have a couple comments and then a question for you. So I want to predicate my question really on my comments. First of all, as a practitioner, I appreciate your presentation and hope that it is now blasting over the YouTube universe for police officers and police chiefs around the world to see.
By the way, I should interrupt to say that this was recorded. So
I was hoping so.
perhaps it is on YouTube.
And I hope it does. And I say that, you know, I'm being a little flip, but for a reason, because YouTube has probably done as much to damage collectively, I think, the image of police officers as anywhere. You know, these little video cameras are everywhere. You can literally now be on the internet and YouTube within a minute of an incident being occurred or having occurred. And my kids have pointed out probably 30 different very unattractive videos of police officers treating people very poorly as their own way of pointing out to me this notion of police legitimacy, the wonder of teenagers in your family, right? There is, at least I'm going to speak specifically to California, that's the system I know best. There is a complete disconnect between how we train and socialize young cops and the notion that you just put forward. And if there is a way somehow to inject these notions into the basic training, the place that we begin the process of teaching police officers how to be cops in this country, that makes eminent sense to me, because you use a term that makes sense to me, but the term we use is this notion of command presence and the use of force continuum. And there is no discussion when you are teaching young cops about why, when you show up at the scene of some incident, doesn't matter what it is, you have to be in charge, and how you can be in charge and at the same time not treat people unfairly, and why it's important to explain people your actions and all of that. We've reframed, in fact, our traffic stop procedures, as have many departments, to, instead of starting out the interaction between the motorist and the police officer, where we typically walk up and say, let me see your license and registration, please, and then we walk back to our car, and the next time you see us is when we're handing you a ticket or whatever, turning that around and saying, good afternoon, my name is Officer Bierman, and I've stopped you because you were speeding. Is there some reason that you might have been speeding? And then we give you the opportunity to explain to us what was going on in your head or why you were doing it, before we've ever now taken that step. Because I can ask you for your license and registration anytime I want. I've got you. I have just detained you, and you're not going anywhere till I say you get to go someplace, right? But we don't think of it that way because we're in charge, and that's the issue of command presence. I'll also tell you that what you talked about will make sense if you translate it into the words that police officers understand. Good traffic officers can get people to thank them for giving them a ticket. It's called selling the ticket. But this notion of legitimacy is something that narcotics officers that have lots of informants that willingly cooperate with them, gang suppression officers that have gang members actually cooperate with them. We have officers assigned to reentry efforts, have parolees tell them about crimes and other things, and school cops that work certain downtown areas where there are street youth around will frequently tell you that the kids cooperate with them, but not because they're wearing a uniform and they're the bad guys. It's because they treat them with dignity and respect, and they'll come talk to them. So I can't encourage you more to do this, and maybe we could chat afterwards about how I get your PowerPoint that I can then distribute to my buddies. But here's my question for you. There's this whole issue for us, at least in my city, has been for quite a while about the metrics we use, performance measurements. And I love to use the phrase measuring what matters because I think that captures it all, and that's a long-time NIJ notion that I think needs to be fleshed out continually because it changes a little bit. How do you talked about collecting data on legitimacy? Very quickly, without, I've taken way more time than I meant to, but how do you measure that in a way that's quick and dirty and effective that police departments can do and embed that as a metric relative to their performance so that we can take this to scale and not just talk about it from an intellectual perspective, but actually make this happen where I, as a police chief, am rated, evaluated, I keep my job or not, based on this notion of legitimacy. What's the easiest way to measure that? And do you have a questionnaire or survey or something? Thanks.
Well, first, it's really great to hear from someone who has on-the-street experience that these ideas make sense. So that's great. It's encouraging. As to measuring it, I'm happy to give you questionnaires. I mean, we have questionnaires both on essentially a community level. They're like the questions I showed you about national surveys. We have questionnaires that we give people after they have a personal experience. For example, kind of an exit interview strategy. The police stopped you last week. We'd like to ask you a couple questions about your experience. I mean, both of those, we can easily give you that. Sure, be happy to do that.
Thank you again for coming to speak with us. I think this was a very enlightening presentation, and I followed your argument through procedural justice leading to legitimacy, leading to cooperation for the police. And it's something that we see in our policing strategies. Sometimes the most successful policing strategies actually lead to an increase in 911 calls. Counterintuitive, but it's because the people in the communities are now trustful of the police and make those calls. So I understand the important role of community cooperation and crime suppression. But my question is whether or not any of the research that you've done or that you're aware of links offender behavior with this perception of police legitimacy. And what brought it to mind is, I'm not going to share my license plate with anyone here, but I also speed down the highway. And I believe that the police are extraordinarily legitimate, and I have a very high view of the police. But that doesn't change my behavior when I'm going down the highway. So I'm wondering whether or not you have if there's a connection between offender behavior and police legitimacy, in addition to community cooperation and otherwise generally relying on the police as someone who could help when you're the person in trouble.
We definitely have research that uses rearrest as the concern. So, for example, some research that Larry Sherman and I did on rearrest after people had an adjudication experience for driving while drunk. Looked over the 4 years after their adjudication experience and showed that if they were fairly treated they perceived they were fairly treated, they thought the law was more legitimate, basically their rate of reoffending was about 20% of that of people who didn't feel the law was legitimate because they didn't experience their courtroom time as procedurally just. So that's an example. I mean, that tries to address exactly